So we're going to move on to the page summary, which is the third page in our application and final page in our application. Remember the process. The person enters their name, their age and their weight in the first screen. You may have noticed that we never actually use the age and the weight. Perhaps that's something that's going to be developed in the future by our client. But what we're going to do is we're going to do the page summary, and this is where after the activities, all the things that they've done during their session, and that's what it was called, a session, will be displayed as a summary, so that you get an overview of everything that was done. So let's look at the page and we'll see how we're going to design it. This is a slightly different approach to ones we've done before, because we've got our main page, and you can see that I've already started to set that up. It'll have its header and so forth, and we'll be doing things with this so that we have a grid within a grid, and that's a very common technique to use, and it has no extra processing power, because remember it's just markup language, so you're just going to have to sort of appreciate the value of this when you see how we do it when we code. So let's start at the top. As I've said, I've already started to put things in. I've got the grid with a margin of 5 now. I've put the background colour of I've put the background colour of corn silk in there. Then I've got my grid, and I'm going to put my row definitions and so forth in there. Just getting off the clipboard. So there's our column definitions for our main grid. Now our main grid is a grid comprised of 2, 3 and row in terms of row height, 3 rows and 2 columns. The 2 columns obviously will accommodate our buttons when we get down to that point. Then what we do is we put a stack panel in to give us our header. I'll just copy it actually. So there's our header, summary, nothing new about that at all, should all be very familiar to you. And this is where it gets a little bit different. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start to put the things that need to go here, in this grey area here, inside another grid entirely. And this grid entirely will be inside another stack panel, sorry. So that's really what we're going to do next. So that's a little bit complicated, and we'll do it, but you'll see why we do it in just a moment. So I think this deserves a comment. Now my comment here is really brief, but you'll see that I'm going to put this stack panel into row 1, which is the second row, obviously here with the big fat space in it, which is the biggest height of 11 of the 16ths. And I'm going to put it in here, and I would, if I were you, I'd put some more column description in here, or sorry, more row, some more graded description in here, what you're going to do, and it makes a really good impression on the people that read your work. So let's just try and start to get this together. So of course I'm going to put my stack panel in. Me and my stack panels, look at me. Stack panel. So I've now got that as a framework, and what I want to do is I want to style this stack panel so that it gets grey. That's all I'm going to do next. I'm going to start to really get angry in a minute. So I'm going to start to style my stack panel so that we get that grey box that was in the middle, and I've got it on my clipboard for the style, so Control V. And I'm saying that this stack panel is going to be inside row 1, which is what I said before. I've got a margin of 10 all round. That means that left, top, right and bottom will have a margin of 10. Height is auto, width is auto to let it stretch and fill, and the background colour is light grey. So that's what I've got for that one. So let's just get the next part of the code. I'm going to put inside this stack panel, I'm going to put a grid. And this grid is going to hold rows that will allow us to enter all of the data summary that we have to put in, and that's been mandated by the assignment. So let me just get that off the particular part of my code, and I can put this in straight away. And there's our row definitions. We don't have any column definitions for this particular grid because it has one column. And what the thing is with WPF Ensemble is that, you know, there's always a row and always a column in the default grid. So you don't have to reference it, you don't have to specify it, you just have to use it if you need to, and it will have a default index in both directions of 0. So that's good. So we've now got a structure where we can start to build up that big grey box to hold all of the things that we need it to hold, and we will populate some at runtime, but some of the information we will include at the beginning. As you saw when I took the screenshot of it, this is here, but there's going to be stuff going in here, and this is here, but there's going to be stuff going in there. So that's the approach that I've taken, and it's quite an interesting approach in terms of the strategy that's being used. It's quite a good strategy, I think, in my opinion, because it allows you to separate these things out and deal with them as you need to. So let's start to put some content in. Now you'll remember that this is an information text block, it's not a data text block. And there you can see it for activity data 4. I'm going to summarize the information in there. And what I want to point out here is that this is going to be in row index 0 of this grid, not the grid up here, this grid here. So that's the row we're talking about. That's index 0 in this grid, and that's where this block is now appearing. There would be a different way of doing that if we were doing something with the other grid, of course. So let's now put in the next one, and this is going to be exactly the same as we did in the previous page. This is going to be something that doesn't have any data at the time we design, but will get data at the time we populate it at runtime. So nothing is showing there at all because it has nothing to show, but it has a name that we can use to push data into it. It has a style which we've designed separately, and this is giving us everything we need for that particular interface element. So let's move on to the next one, and the next one is for the data display of the number of activities. And that's that one, and once again that's another empty one, so it's pretty straightforward to see what's happening here. It's got a unique name that we can refer to in our code, and we can push data into there. Unlike a text box, where we're putting a name on something like a text box, so that we can pull data out of it, we can harvest the data that it contains. So let's go on and just carry on with these. So I'm going to paste it in. This one's pretty straightforward, so we got that. Now I've put some margins on here because I wanted to emphasize it and give it a bit of space at the bottom particularly, because what we're going to do is we're going to start to use the code that we've created in our logic to give more than we were asked for in our assignment, and this is the minutes of the exercise that were completed by the person in that session. Never actually asked for that, I can't remember. I don't think we were. I don't remember us being asked for that, but it certainly adds some excellence to the application. So let's move on. We've got another bit of information here, and this one is going to be total used. This is just information. It doesn't get any data at runtime. It's just to inform the user of what the data is below. And then the next one is where we're going to put calories used or the rate used in the next one when we actually get to it. So the next one's exactly the same as before. I know you probably get a bit bored with this, but it's not fair of me not to explain it. So we're still inside the grid. We're putting grid row 5, which is the 6th row. You've seen what we've got. We're going to put a result in here. This is the total used text block. So there's nothing in it at the moment, but this is something that we will populate with the rate multiplied by the minutes and so forth, and we'll give an overall result. And because of this, I'm going to give it font size 60, which is big, and I'm giving it a foreground of red just to indicate that it's data, whereas these blue ones are usually about saying that this is an information text block. So that's what we're doing there. So that's actually what we've got to do in that grid. Now I've got something I want to add here, just outside the grid, but before the stack panel finishes, I'm putting a spare text block. I'm not convinced I'm going to use this yet, but I might. So I'm going to just copy this off my clipboard. I'm not convinced this is a good solution for this particular part of the problem, but there we go. And I've put another text block in there. So we've got our grid starting to be used. It starts to look like our design. It's really easy to make things that are changed, and I would like you to change things so that, for example, light grey becomes light blue, corn silk becomes something entirely different for you. You should maybe start to look at how you would put good colour schemes together, where a background colour goes with a foreground colour. If I put here pink, you see immediately I get that. So that's what I want you to do. I want you to make sure that you can pick out unique combinations so that they're all kind of different from each other. Otherwise it looks like you're just doing exactly what you were told to do. So that's pretty good. So we can now move on to the final component of this particular page, which is going to be our buttons, which go underneath here back in the main grid. So we're back inside the main grid. We've left that big grid that we dealt with this alone. So we're now in the third row of the grid, row 0, row 1 and row 2 indexed. So I'll just paste this in because we take a slightly different approach here yet again to try and give you some variety in what we're doing. So in order to get our effect here, what I did was very much the same as I did before when I talked about getting 2 into 3. I made a new grid. So in my grid row 2, which is this one, I've put height equals auto, which is something kind of new, and then I make my grid. And this time I only want 2 columns, the same as we did with the previous 2 buttons. So this is exactly what we did before. And then inside there I'm putting a stack panel, and this is going to be in row 0, column 0. The usual thing, the button with a name so that we can capture its events, and we'll add events when we start to do our code in the next video. And its title is back, and that takes us back to page activity. And then another stat panel for this other button, which is here in grid column 1. Same stuff, so style's exactly the same as we're using through all of them. A name and some text. So once again this style thing comes up again, doesn't it? So we're using this style so all of our buttons on all of our pages look the same. And when I see people developing applications in Windows Forms, that's one of the things they kind of get a bit wrong. Either the font's slightly different because there's so much to set, but by referring to things by a single useful name, we're going to be able to apply these styles coherently so that everything looks as it should throughout everything that's using it. So there we are. We've finished our interface. Bit of a slog, but I hope you've learned lots of new stuff. We go back into some C# coding immediately, where we'll start to take what we've got and put it all together using the glue that we've already created from our classes that we did first stage of this application development cycle.